I think that important about discursive, reasoning versus other forms of contemplation is important, and it leads us back to that question of, our heavenly end that Father Pine raises. Our contemplative end in heaven, and how we prepare ourselves for that, and how we participate in that end even on Earth. So I mean, it raises the question of like, will these art forms be in heaven? Will there be movies in heaven? Will there be novels in heaven? And we know music will be in heaven based on Scripture. So we know that. Maybe not fiction, maybe not storytelling as we know it, other than sort of the story of God's providence in history. I don't know, but we could also ask whether speculative theology, will be in heaven. And I think the answer has to be that only insofar as its end is concerned. I mean, I think that a lot of these things that we do on earth will be absorbed into their final end of contemplation of God, because speculative theology, it proceeds by what we would call discursive reason. Not only by that, it obviously has to be fed by prayer and a deeper form of contemplation, but the day-to-day workings of it are through words, thinking, syllogisms, logic. But the way that we contemplate God in heaven is not going to be discursive, and the way that we understand the new earth is not going to be through chemical analysis. And so it's going to be this simple moment of vision where our knowledge is more, in a supernatural way, elevated to the angelic or the divine form of knowledge. And we are just not going to be reasoning things out step by step in heaven the same way that we do on earth. So I think that that raises the question then of whether art forms, as you mentioned in the case of film, can aid us in practicing that form of beholding that is more simple and more immediate, more intuitive. The mode in which we experience it is more at least analogous to the mode of contemplation we'll be doing in heaven. Because music as such, pop music is music that, especially today, is dominated by lyrics. But taken in itself, music is sound, organized in time for the purpose of beauty, melody, harmony, rhythm. And it's sort of the art form that is the purest and the most itself. It requires the least reference to things outside of itself. Whereas, anything involving words, for example, is by necessity dealing with conceptual references outside of the work itself, and culture, and any storytelling is dealing with cultural references and language and so on. And film in particular is not necessarily dominated by words, but it's a combination of so many different elements. And so music is instrumental music is really the simplest of the art forms, while film is one of the most complex. So it's interesting to talk about those things as two sides of the spectrum as well. But I want to say that particularly in music, we experience a reflection of the beauty of God. And I would say in all art forms that aim toward beauty to one degree or another. But especially in music, we experience our capacity to receive the beauty of God in the depths of our souls in a more immediate and a more simple way. And so, again, it's training for contemplation, and it's also I think there's a certain amount of interior freedom that it can cultivate, precisely because it allows us to detach from the words and concepts which help us to understand reality and enter into reality, but can also help us to can also be a temptation to feel like we fully understand reality, or to dominate reality, or to shape reality according to our minds rather than shaping our minds according to reality. So I think that all the arts can do this to one extent, can help us with this to one extent or another, but in particular music. It is intellectual, but it rises, it both reaches us below the level of discursive reason, on the level of the imagination and the senses and the physiology, and also above that level, because we are contemplating something that is intellectually ordered, but not with a conceptual referent for the most part. It's not trying to evoke concepts in us, and as soon as you start thinking of concepts, you're no longer listening to music. And as soon as you start focusing on your emotions, also, even though it's valid, of course, and universal to have emotional responses to music, once you're focusing on something other than the sounds, you're no longer listening to music. So music allows us to rise above that. It also allows us to be simple, because music in itself is the simplest, like I was saying, it's the simplest and purest of the art forms. So there is an experience of oneness that you have when you're truly listening deeply to music and tapped into it that no other art form accomplishes to the same degree. Even though the other art forms, as has been said, often aspire to the condition of music. This can be done in good or misguided ways. And I think that's one way in which it's good, is to aspire to that simplicity of inner form, that unitary, that oneness of form, which also creates a oneness in the beholder. It teaches us to go out of ourselves, and this is true with all forms of contemplation, and to go into ourselves in the same way. When you just focus on the emotions in listening to a piece of music, it's almost like you're skipping the going out of yourself part and just sort of going into yourself on a superficial level. The great jazz pianist Bill Evans said that for him, the function of music was putting you in touch with a part of yourself that you didn't know existed. So music activates parts of ourselves and not just emotions. It activates parts of the soul that we only experience through contact with other things, because human beings don't perceive our own soul directly, but only in its operations. Aquinas talks about this knowledge by connaturality, which means that your mind is actually conforming itself to the object. And so the object, it's a going out and a going in. So you're forming yourself, you're knowing yourself as formed in the act of contemplation. The mind in its somehow becomes sensible to itself in sensing this object. And I wouldn't want to say that this is exclusive to music, but it happens in music in a particularly pure way because it's not mediated by concepts. Those are all ways in which music can prepare us for things like silent prayer or for the experience of knowledge in heaven. And that's one reason that music is going to exist in heaven, because it is so fitting to that mode of knowledge. So going back to this problem of recollection and distraction, the problem is not, of course, different music has different physiological effects, and certain music is less appropriate to the liturgy, partially for that reason, or it might be less helpful in the background for study. But when you're actually listening and focusing on music, it's a different experience, because like I was talking about fast editing and rhythm and those things being subordinated to a higher purpose, it's the same for the listener. Because this is my experience, is that listening to exciting music is not necessarily less recollected or contemplative of an experience than listening to music that has a more calming physiological effect, or music that is less...
So can I just say, to put it in concrete terms, are you saying that you could feel as recollected listening to 60s jazz compared to Gregorian chant?
Feeling is not quite the right word, and Gregorian chant is not a fair comparison because it has this grace on it and this cultivation for the purpose of recollection. But, compared to, compared to Mozart or something, the point is that when you are truly listening to music and you're truly contemplating the beauty of musical sounds, your focus is on that thing. And so you are, in your bodily experience, all the bodily effects of the music are being properly subordinated to the higher aspects of music. But when you're putting music on in the background, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing to do in itself, but when you're putting music on in the background, what you're not doing is fully experiencing the intellectual, and I don't mean analytical, but the intellectual in a pure contemplative sense aspect of music, because you're not focused on it. Instead, you're more experiencing it as it comes to your senses, whether that's in a relaxing way, an energizing way, a stimulating way. And so I think when we talk about music in terms of like what distracts us for the purposes of study, we're bypassing the actual proper experience of listening to music, where that exciting effect is still there, but it is united in this experience of contemplation. And you can listen to very frenetic and even dissonant at times music and have it be a deep contemplative experience, regardless, within limits, but regardless of the physiological effect. Of course, this will depend on the people's temperaments and you know, their sensitivity to these things. But the point is the mode of listening, the mode of contemplation with which you're engaged with it. Just as you can experience a story that's exciting on a shallow level or on a deep level. And the fact that it's exciting, you could say it can be a distraction, but it's not in itself an obstacle to contemplation. And in fact, it can draw you into contemplation as well. The other problem, and this is how I engaged with music when I first started getting really into music as a teenager in my heavy metal days, was I would spend lots of time focusing on the music or listening to music and not in the background while doing other things. But I was so focused on I wasn't indifferent to the musical content by any means, but I was very much involved in this sort of getting into an emotional, associative reverie and the moods that the music would put me in, and sort of focused on that. And that also can blind you to, or deafen you to the actual qualities of the music and whether it has that depth. So this all kind of leads back to a point that I was alluding to a couple times before. And that is that we should judge things by the depth that they're able to accommodate, the depth of encounter that they are able to accommodate, rather than sort of the shallow level that people can enjoy them on. How do I listen to the music that I listen to? Even if it's good, it's like, what level am I engaging? What level am I engaging on it with? And so I think that there's always room to go deeper. Even if one is listening to a good piece of pop music by, you know, Frank Sinatra, is like, what level am I engaging on this with? Am I really listening to it on a musical level? Am I just sort of remaining on the surface, on the level of mood or the level of lyrics and all of those things? And we don't always have to be complete purists, but I think we should know what we're doing. We should know what the activity we're fundamentally participating is. And when people say, you know, well, here's the thing I've experienced when listening to music, and then go on to write 2 paragraphs about lyrics and not even mention musical qualities, then we know we're not really clear on what it is that we're talking about here. And the same with just talking about how music affects our study and things like that. Well, we have to make sure that we're really engaging on the proper level. And it may be that much of the music and the mass culture today just doesn't support that kind of listening. We have to get away from this idea that, oh, well, as long as we avoid music that's, emphasizes the second and fourth beat of the measure, then we'll be fine. You know what I mean? It's like, it's the spirit of it. It's the integrity of it. And it's not so much, this is something that'll come up later, but it's not so much the minimum level at which you can engage of an exciting plot or, you know, an exciting rhythm or something. It's not having those things that's bad. It's leaving it at that. You know what I mean? It's the fact, it's these things should be judged by the highest depth with which you can engage with them, rather than by the fact that it's possible to engage with them on a shallow level. Mm-hmm. So it's always, as with our, Augustinian principles of good and evil, evil is a privation. So it's not so much about what's present in these things, speaking on a formal level, I mean,
yes.
that is as what is absent in them.
Yes.
Roger Scruton said something for which I love him, and I've never read anything but a couple of things from him. But I always appreciate him because he said this thing that I've never heard another conservative commenting on modern pop music say, which is that the problem with it is that not that it's too rhythmic, but it's not rhythmic enough. So I think that when music lacks those things, when music lacks that depth, it's not fit for being used for a contemplative end, which means that it's fit for being used for lower ends. So I've never bought into this theory that certain kinds of that certain kinds of rhythms are intrinsically sexual, or that they're demonic or vicious, or that certain modes. I don't agree with the Platonic theory taken at face value. On other levels, I do agree with it about this mode makes you cowardly and this mode, that kind of thing. Because the word mode had a much broader range of associations than what we understand as a mode today, or in the medieval sense of the word mode. So it's not so much that a certain rhythm or even a certain repetitive rhythm, is going to lead you to vice in itself. The problem is when all you've got is a physiological response because it's not musically interesting. Boredom is not a healthy spiritual state, so to speak. Idle hands are the devil's playthings. So all you've got is this boring physiological input, which is not bad in itself, but it's not being subordinated to anything higher. And it is objectively boring if you listen to it for its musical qualities. So the question becomes then, why did somebody make this boring music? Or why would somebody put on this boring music? Well, it's not for a musical purpose because it doesn't fulfill a musical purpose. So then you have to ask, what other utility is this being put towards? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it might be something innocent that's a non-musical purpose, but it might be something nefarious. It might be that you're isolating the physiological aspect of the experience, which is not bad in itself, and using that to induce a frenzied state of some kind, or to numb yourself or something like that, or you're focusing on your own emotions to an unhealthy degree. So this is my response to the people who would say, oh, certain rhythms are immoral. Well, no, they're not. But when music is reduced, I'm not even saying reduced to the level of rhythm, because rhythm is a beautiful thing, but reduced to the level of boring, repetitive rhythms, and there's not much else going on, that has to be filled in with something. And sometimes it's going to be something bad. You know what I mean? And you can also fill in music that has depth with something bad. But the problem, so you can listen to a good pop song and dance immorally to it. But the thing is that if it's not even a good pop song, then it's only fit to be used for something other than a musical purpose. And, the stupider the music is, by analogy, at the very least, the more conducive to stupid activity it is. So it's the boringness and the mediocrity. It's not fit for a higher purpose, so naturally it's going to be put to a lower purpose or to a bad purpose. It's not that the positive content of the music rhythmically or the syncopation is a bad thing. It's not the fact that it gets your pulse up is a bad thing. It's that it's not fit for anything more than that in certain cases. Does that make sense? So I'm putting an Augustinian take indirectly, onto music here.